Well, welcome everyone. My name is Kathy Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and we're so happy to see your faces today. And welcome to this webinar on reopening your workplace safely. So much for us to think about throughout this pandemic, and certainly still much more to think about as we go forward. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to cover a little bit of logistics and do some introductions in just a moment. But first of all, just wanted to recognize where we are positioned and the land that we're on. First of all, if you're new to ONN, we're the network for Ontario's nonprofits and charities. We advocate on behalf of the sector, primarily at the provincial level, a little bit at the federal level, and we focus on advocacy, policy, and services to strengthen Ontario's nonprofit sector as a key pillar of our society and our economy. So if you're already a member of ONN, welcome back and thank you for your support. Our policy research and analysis work would not be possible without you. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, such as a visual lag, we recommend closing your web browser and reopening it. If you still experience any problems, you can type the issue into the chat box and our tech team will respond as soon as possible. One of the reasons we're using Zoom is because it does have closed captioning. So to turn on captions, please click the CC icon in your Zoom window, if that's something that will be helpful to you. We certainly encourage you to ask questions through the chat box. We're going to be stopping a couple of times after the speakers for a couple questions, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. And please use the chat box to ask those questions. And my colleague Kavita and John are here on the phone, here on the line with us, and they will be grabbing those questions and we'll be sure to ask them to our speaker. We know that the most commonly asked questions is, will you get this recording and the slide deck? And yes, you will. We promise within a week, you will get the recording and the slide deck. So just to answer that commonly FAQ. So to ground our work today, I would like to acknowledge that ONN, here at ONN, we're working on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt and the Upper Canada Treaties. I typically join from Erin, Ontario, which is the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today I am in the office, one of the first times I've been in the office in 2021, so it is a bit delightful to be here. But at ONN, we really believe that nonprofits have a really critical role to play in terms of truth and reconciliation and responding to the calls to action. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to live and work on these territories. And as individuals, we all have an obligation. To learn from Indigenous communities about their collective ownership and sustainable economic and environmental systems that are respectful of the land and the water on which we all depend. We encourage all of you and your organizations to read the 94 calls to action, as well as the missing and murdered Indigenous women reports and actions, and to be accountable for the ones that are connected to your work. So thank you again for joining us. So today's topic, the return to work, is a really important one. We're getting lots of questions here at ONN, and I'm delighted to have two wonderful presenters here with us today. So joining me are Jackie Sam and Kirsten Grant. Jackie works as a health and safety consultant at the Public Services Health and Safety Association, where she's been involved in product development, piloting innovative health and safety solutions, and providing specialized consulting services to Ontario's public services sector. So welcome, Jackie. And Kirsten is the Director of People and Wellness for the Canadian Mental Health Association, the Ontario Division, with over 20 years of international HR leadership experience in the professional services and not-for-profit sectors, and a great ally of ONN. So welcome, Kirsten. So today we're going to hear from Jackie first, then we're going to hear from Kirsten. As I mentioned, you can use the Q&A and we'll stop between for a few questions, and then we'll spend some time at the end. So Jackie, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kathy, for the lovely introduction. And I'm happy to be here today to speak with the Ontario Nonprofit Network on this topic of reopening safely. If you could just go to the next slide, please, John. Great. And I'll be talking about the key considerations for reopening a workplace safely. And next slide, please. And so I am a health and safety consultant with the Public Services Health and Safety Association. So just a little bit about us in case you're unfamiliar with PSHSA. We are actually a nonprofit organization ourselves, and we are one of 4 designated health and safety associations in Ontario, and we are a funded partner of the Ministry of Labour Training and Skills Development. We provide occupational health and safety expertise to Ontario's public services sectors. So that includes education and culture sectors, healthcare and community care, government and municipalities, as well as public safety, so police, fire, and paramedics, as well as First Nations communities. And since the start of March 2020, we've been working collaboratively with the Ministry of Labour, as well as our other health and safety organizations, to develop a lot of job guidelines, as well as health and safety protocols for the workplace around COVID-19. Next slide, please. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, is really those key considerations for reopening. And I like to think of reopening as a process, and we'll go over sort of the REs of reopening, going from the start to the first phase of readiness to recovery, and then finally to reevaluation. And as I'm going through each of these components, I'll also highlight and point out some specific tools and resources that you can access that can help support each of these phases. And once you do get a copy of these slides, all of the resources that I refer to are hyperlinked, so you'll be able to access those directly. And then we'll also have some time for question and answer as well. And just given that we have a wide ranging audience today, I will be taking a more general perspective when I'm talking about these considerations for the workplace. But I do appreciate that there may be some workplace specific questions, and I hope to address some of those once we get to the question and answer period. Okay, so next slide, please. So the first phase of reopening is readiness. And this is really about assessing the situation and understanding where you are so that you're able to determine what the next steps are going to be to help you prepare and plan for that reopening. Next slide, please. So one of the tools that you could use to help you assess how ready you are and how prepared you are for returning to the workplace would be the workplace readiness assessment that we've developed. And this is really a self-administered questionnaire where we ask employers to rate how confident they feel regarding the following parameters. And with every organization, they may be at a different level of readiness depending on how they have been operating over the last year and a half. There may be some organizations that have been open and operating throughout the pandemic, others who may have been closed for a good majority of that time, and a lot of organizations that might be in between. So really depending on where you are, this is going to help prompt thinking, as well as bring to light some considerations that are necessary when we're thinking about a safe and sustainable return to work. So some of the parameters that are included in this questionnaire include thinking about if you have the means to implement a gradual increase in production and business operations, and what does that look like for your business and your organization. We also need to think about managing staff shortages and absences, and what that staffing capacity and how that may impact your business operations. We need to think about establishing those systems for screening, testing, contact tracing, and reporting, and really also understanding what those requirements are. So who do we need to contact and when, and what are those types of scenarios that might trigger a report to a certain agency or not. There's also systems that need to be in place to maintain communications, and that's both internally for your staff and the other people who work in your workplace, as well as external stakeholders as well, which would include your clients, your customers, your visitors, and other people that may be entering your workplace. And it's really to know that you have those systems in place so that you can disseminate important information in a timely manner. We also need to implement protective control measures to mitigate the risk of exposure. And I will talk a little bit more about that in our next few slides as well. We need to think about strategies for safeguarding mental health and worker support, which we'll talk about a little bit more as well later on in the presentation. And then also ensuring that there is leadership commitment to promote acceptance of change, and also to ensure that there is a smooth transition back to the workplace. So these are just a few things to just think about as you're preparing and planning for that return to work, and really understand and gauge where you are as an organization and as a workplace, and if you have these systems in place, and if not, and if there's an areas where you may be lacking or there may be some gaps, then those are some areas that you may want to focus on to ensure that you have those processes in place before people are coming back into the workplace. Next slide, please. So another thing that is important to do as well before having people come into the workplace is a risk assessment. So we do have a template, which is the General Infectious Disease Risk Assessment template that you can access as well. Next slide, or next click, please. And part of that process of identifying risk or doing a risk assessment is really to identify the level of risk that exists in your workplace. So we need to understand modes of transmission as well as potential exposures. Next click. And as we know with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID-19, these are some of the situations that can lead to potential exposures or increased risks. And that includes close contact with other individuals, closed spaces, crowded places in poorly ventilated areas, forceful exhalation, as well as prolonged exposure. Next click. And then we also, part of the risk assessment process is to analyze the risk as well. So you need to think from your own workplace perspective, the existing controls that are in place, and also the contributing factors that might lead to a potential exposure. So this is where you have to consider how people and equipment may interact. So that may be from staff and coworkers to also members of the public and other people that are entering your workplace. We need to think about specific processes and job tasks and how people are interacting and how those types of things will take place. We need to think about our environment as well. You know, if we're doing things indoors versus outdoors, the physical space of the facility, and also knowing and understanding aspects of the pathogen. So knowing the modes of transmission and what might lead to potential exposures. Next click. And the next step of the risk assessment is assessing the risk. So once you've taken into consideration the existing controls that are in place, as well as those contributing factors, then we can assess if those particular situations are low, medium, or high risk. And when you're thinking about risk, the two parameters that you really need to consider are likelihood of exposure, as well as severity of consequence, which in this case would be a potential exposure leading to a potential infection. Next click. And then the final step of the risk assessment is to manage that risk. So with all of these things taken into consideration, are there further controls that need to be put into place? And then we also need to refer to the hierarchy of controls when we're thinking about those types of things. And I'll talk a little bit more about the hierarchy in the next couple of slides. And with all of that information, we need to develop an action plan. And we also need to have a means of evaluating to understand whether or not the controls that we're putting into place are working as intended. Next click. And so this is just a diagram of that hierarchy of controls. And in the health and safety world, we kind of refer to this as the multi-layered preventative practices when we're thinking about implementing controls, starting from the most effective, which is elimination, towards the least effective, which would be personal protective equipment, because that is just at the level of the worker. Next slide, please. And so once you've taken all of that into consideration and you've assessed where you are, you've understand what are the things that you need to be, the things that you might need to put into place and what that action plan might look like, then it's also important that you document that plan as well. So in fact, it is required by law to have a workplace safety plan. And this was mandated by the Ministry of Labor. And they do provide a template and a checklist that will help you prepare that plan and to help document that plan. And it does need to be made available to anyone who asks to see it. So that includes a ministry inspector if they happen to come to your workplace to do an inspection. And it also needs to be posted in a place where it can be seen easily. And it is important that when you are formulating your safety plan, that you consider those sector-specific requirements. And so employers are encouraged to review that plan regularly to ensure that it's updated and that you continue to meet those requirements. Next slide, please. So now that we've assessed and prepared, the next step into our reopening phase would be the recovery process. And this is all about implementation. So knowing what our action plan is, we need to make sure that action plan is put into practice and that we have those supports in place and those protective measures in place to ensure that we have a safe environment when our staff come back to the workplace. Next slide. So this is an infographic from the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. And it really explains the different types of control measures in the workplace, applying the hierarchy of controls. And you'll see if you read through the font here, it's a reiteration of a lot of the public health measures that we have been hearing since the beginning of the pandemic. So practicing physical distancing, practicing good hand hygiene, as well as respiratory etiquette. And then there are other specific control measures for COVID-19 that we need to consider as well as we are applying the hierarchy of controls. Next click, please. So there's that hierarchy there where it documents from most effective to least effective. Next click. And something that's not included in this infographic, because it is from a little bit earlier on, is information about vaccination. And vaccination would be included in the category of elimination as well as administrative controls. But I won't be spending too much time on vaccination because I know we've already had a webinar dedicated about this. But if there are questions about it, we can talk about that later as well. Next click. So if we go through this infographic, there's information there about the different controls that are included in each of these categories. So with elimination and substitution, we need to consider, are there areas or are there tasks where remote work can still be something that can be done? And then also considering individual circumstances as well for people who may not feel comfortable coming back to the workplace or people who may not be able to for whatever reason or personal circumstance. And we need to think about those types of accommodations that we would have to implement in the work. Next click. And then for engineering and administrative controls, this is where we need to think about those physical barriers as well as the ventilation systems in our buildings and ensuring that those are all placed in the appropriate places and that it's functioning appropriately. And of course, all of these controls and what you are going to implement in your workplace is going to be informed by that risk assessment that you will do. And in terms of administrative controls, this is where we need to think about occupancy limits, as well as how do we might change our work practices to encourage physical distancing? Are there changes in scheduling or staggering start times or end times that we have to think about, as well as things like cleaning and disinfection and how often that's going to happen at work. Next click. And then at the end of the hierarchy is also thinking about personal protective equipment. So are there situations where your workers will have to come into close contact with other individuals, and do they require those levels of protection? And then in terms of general mask wearing, what are the policies that you have in place, and how is that going to function, and how is that documented? Next click. Okay. So other resources that you can refer to as well that will talk a little bit more about those hierarchy controls and giving you more specific guidance on how to apply those parameters in your workplace would be, I've outlined them here in this slide. So if you could just do one click. So there's a CSA report that they published about workplace and COVID-19 and all the different types of occupational health and safety considerations for reopening during the pandemic. Next click. We also have job guidelines that was developed by the Ministry of Labor as well as the other health and safety associations for sector-specific jobs, as well as sector-specific guidelines that will give you more specific information. And then next click. And then other resources that you could refer to as well would be things like your local public health unit, as well as public health agencies, your municipality and your region. They may have some specific rules or regulations that may apply to you. There could be the ministries that you can refer to for more information, as well as your professional association can also provide you with some specific guidance as well. And then also the other health and safety associations. So as I mentioned, we are one of 4 and we cover public services sectors, but then we also have our sister organizations, which is the infrastructure, health and safety, which covers construction, electrical, as well as transportation sectors. There's workplace safety and prevention services that cover agricultural, agricultural service sectors as well. And then there's Workplace Safety North that covers mining, forestry, as well as communities in Northern Ontario. And then there's also the Ontario Health Clinics for Ontario Workers that has a lot of really great free resources that you can access on their website that provides guidance and tools and resources around COVID-19. And some of the other things that we get a lot of questions about and that we do have some resources at PSHSA would be information specific to ventilation. We do have a webinar that we did earlier on that has information about how do you assess ventilation and what does it mean and what are the different things you need to consider when you're looking at a ventilation system. We have information about a respiratory protection program and the different considerations that you would need to include in that type of program. And we also have a specific training program as well to train the fit tester. So if that's a service that is required at your workplace, we also provide training for that. And we also will be developing, and it's coming soon, is a vaccination guidance as well. So watch out for that as it comes out in the near future, hopefully. So next slide, please. And so in addition to those occupational health and safety measures, we also need to ensure that we have the proper employee support. So that includes training and education. So ensuring that we are providing our workers with all of the relevant health and safety measures. And we also have training programs that are free. We have an infection prevention and control training that is offered through our website. There's also health and safety training that is offered now for free for small businesses as well. We need to ensure that there's mental health and psychological safety supports that are put into place. So this could be targeted support or maybe enhanced support. And we also offer resources around resilience as well as psychological safety in the workplace as well. We need to think about return to work and accommodation. So what does the reorientation process look like for our staff members? Or are there specific accommodations that we need to consider or that we need to have in place for those that are returning to the workplace? And we do also have a training program around mental health return to work for health and community care as well as first responder organizations. And then lastly, we also always need to ensure that we are informing and communicating in order to provide that support. So that includes information about any internal company or external government supports that may be available to our staff members, changes in company policies, procedures, and operations, and how that may affect individuals and other stakeholders, and always ensuring that those communication lines are kept open, so internally and externally, so that everyone is getting the information that they need, because that's really going to help reassure individuals and provide them with what the information that they require in order to feel confident when they're coming back to the workplace and they know who it is that they need to go to or ask questions to if they do have any concerns or issues. And then the last phase of that reopening process is reevaluation. So this is all about continuous monitoring, continuous improvement, and also ensuring that we're ready to pivot and adapt when necessary. And as we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic, the situation continues to change, continues to evolve, and there's always new things that are coming. So it's like we're chasing a moving target. So we always need to be ready to pivot and adapt to what those might be. Next slide, please. So the reevaluation process is really about continuous improvement. And some of you may have used this framework of the Plan, Do, Check, Act in order to put this into perspective. And this is also a really good summary of the things that we just talked about in our presentation today. So the first thing is really the planning stage, and that's where we talked about readiness and ensuring that we're able to assess and prepare for the situation. The next phase would be the do part, which is the recovery. So the implementation of all the different action pieces that we need to put into practice. Next would be the check piece, which is that reevaluation piece, continuously monitoring the situation and ensuring that the controls that we have in place are working as intended. And then lastly, it's that acting. So if there are changes that need to be made or modifications or things that need to be done differently, then we are in that position where we're able to act and we're able to pivot and adapt to what is necessary. And something that is going to help with that is the business continuity plan. If you just do the next click, please, John. Yeah, so we do have a template there for business continuity planning, and that is just really going to help ensure that during times of emergency or in any adverse event, that you are able to continue your business operations as efficiently and safely as possible. And if you go to the next slide. So that concludes my presentation. And if we can stop now for a few questions as well.
Great. Thanks so much. That was really helpful. And you went through so many wonderful resources and tips. So first of all, off the top, all of the resources that Jackie mentioned will be linked in the slide deck that you will get, but they're also, I believe they're all on your website. Is that correct, Jackie?
Yes.
Okay, so the website is, can you remind us?
So if you go to pshsa.ca, we do have a COVID-19 resource center, and all of that information can be found there. So anything specific to COVID-19. And if you're interested in any of the training programs that I mentioned, you can also find that through the search box on our website as well.
Great, awesome. We've got a ton of questions, so I'm going to ask you two or three right now, and then save some for the end after, because Kirsten might address some of these as well. Okay. And just for the audience, we'll hold the vaccine questions until the end if we have time to get to them, and we will also share. We did a webinar last week and have an FAQ from a lawyer with respect to vaccination that we can share with everyone as well, and I think someone shared it on the link. So there's a couple questions about ventilation systems, Jackie. So is there a tool, or are there people that nonprofits can access to check their airflow and air quality in their buildings? And what happens if the landlord doesn't want to do that and you're a tenant?
Mm-hmm. So there is a tool that you can access through OCAL. So they've developed a checklist that has all the information of different things that you should assess for in your ventilation system. So that is a free resource that is available on their website. I think in the slide deck, I did hyperlink to that. So you should be able to get that.
And sorry, what's OCAL?
So that's the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers. They're an association that provides a lot of occupational health and safety information to all of Ontario. So they did develop a checklist specific to ventilation for the things that should be assessed for. And then we also had that ventilation webinar where we had someone speak about that as well. So that is a free resource that you could go to. And in terms of the person who is actually doing the assessment, it should be someone who is trained and has the expertise to do so. So it usually might be your facilities person or a technician of some sort that has the expertise to look for those types of things. And there was a second part of that question, right?
Yeah, so what happens if you have no control over the property's ventilation and cleaning outside of your own office space? So you're a tenant and you're not the landlord.
Mm-hmm. So I would say that if you do have any questions or concerns, you could always address that to the person who would be in charge of checking for those systems. And then what you could do on your own as well to help with ventilation and circulation is just to ensure that you keep windows open and doors open as much as possible so that you can improve the air circulation and airflow in your environment, as well as wearing masks as well when you're indoors, and trying to do work outdoors as much as possible, and maintaining physical distancing. So really practicing all those other public health measures will help as well. Ventilation is only one piece of that, of the hierarchy of controls. It's an engineering control, but we also have all those other types of controls that we can put into place. So it's really about taking that multi-layered approach and just trying to advocate and ask the appropriate parties in terms of what they can do with ventilation system.
Okay, that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand on when you talked about prolonged exposure, what is considered prolonged exposure? So for example, if an organization is hosting a workshop for 2 hours, is that considered
Mm-hmm.
prolonged exposure?
So the definition that I've seen for prolonged exposure would be anything more than 15 to 20 minutes with a potentially infectious person. So, and that is if you're in close contact with someone for that period of time where you are in close contact with them, where you don't have a physical barrier around you and you're not wearing any PPE.
Great, thank you. And maybe one more question, and then we'll turn to Kirsten. Transportation, there's certain things we can control perhaps about the office space, but can you speak to transportation? Because some organizations might feel, or staff might feel, that their office is safe, but it's the getting to the office, taking the subway, public transit, that they're concerned about.
So I guess, so is the question, what are some strategies that they can implement to?
Yeah, how does that feed into the risk assessment of whether you open the office or have people return to work?
I guess they would have to consider, some organizations might have the means to, if they're doing, if they have a strategy where they may be cohorting certain team members, they could think about something like a carpooling or type of dedicated transportation for teams that would be working with each other anyhow. Other strategies could just be to think about what additional procedures or policies that you might want to put into place to ensure that those who are coming into the work through public transportation are doing what they need to do to be safe while they're doing so. So maybe you want to ask and ensure that those individuals that they're screening themselves before they come into the workplace, that they are wearing their masks while they are while they're in the transportation vehicle while going into work. And also practicing good hand hygiene once they get into the workplace. And also, and in general, in the workplace, we would be practicing physical distancing as well. So it's, again, just kind of implementing those multi-layered approaches and trying to do as much as we can to be safe. Because of course, not everyone will have too many options in terms of how they would get to work. And if we need to rely on public transportation, then we just need to make sure that we're doing that as safe as possible.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Jackie. We have more questions coming in, but first we're going to hear from Kirsten. Kirsten, welcome, and over to you.
Hi, everybody. I keep wanting to say good morning, although it's 1:30. So good afternoon to all of you who are in the same time zone. Thanks so much, Kathy and ONN, for inviting me to speak today. I'm sure we learned from the vaccination session that there are always tons and tons of questions, and there's real value to addressing those at the end. So I might speak a little bit quickly now to get through things, but hopefully we'll have lots of time at the end for that. As Kathy mentioned, I'm the Director of People and Wellness for CMHA Ontario, that's Canadian Mental Health Association. We're an association or a federation of branches across Canada, in 300 communities, that's been serving Canadians since 1918. We're quite an old not-for-profit healthcare association. We in Ontario deliver programs and services to those who need mental health and addictions help. We do a lot of advocacy work on behalf of our branches and Ontarians with mental health and addictions issues. And of course, we provide policy advice to government. It's a big part of our work. We are funding partners of the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Colleges and Universities, and the Solicitor General's Office. So just a little nutshell of who I am and where I've come from. Next slide, please, John. Thank you. I'm not used to not having that control. So as Kathy mentioned, I have 20 years experience in the HR world. At some point that will become 25, but for now we're sticking with 20. And have the unfortunate experience of being in HR leadership positions during a number of world crises. And so COVID was no exception. And my career in this effort, one could say, started with 9/11, which was almost exactly 20 years ago. So I thought my value in this session might be in walking you through what my process has been. We went through this process ourselves last summer and preparing to open last September, which was a fleeting but wonderful 3 weeks. And then, of course, going through this with various not-for-profits that I consult to over the course of the year, because we're all at very different points in whether or not we need to be open. And so this has been an ongoing thought process for me, and I thought I would share that with you now. So I thought I would do that most constructively by walking through 4 questions that really are things you can go through if you're not already fully open, which I'll address the question for you. Is it time? Is it time to open? So do we need in-person interaction to serve our members, clients, and patients? Can we do so safely? What does safe reopening look like for us? And then can I address colleague stakeholder concerns effectively in a way that protects their psychological safety and engages and retains them? And from a number of questions that I've seen come in, I think that last bullet point we'll try and spend the most amount of time on. So again, I'll go through the first three rather briefly. Next slide, please, John. So do we need in-person interaction to serve our members, clients, or patients? And this is something you can only answer for yourself. Of course, many organizations have been able to deliver their service virtually quite successfully over the past year and a half. Others, of course, are not. If you are a soccer club, that is not something you can do virtually. If you are developing in-person safe exchange needle sites, that's not something you can do virtually. So this is a starting point for asking, is now the time to open? Or are we unable to deliver on our mandate by operating virtually? Second question is, do we have a mandate to deliver in-person services? So some of us are funded by organizations or government, which require us to deliver, and sometimes that has to be done in person with some of the examples I gave already. So another question for you to ask, because if you lose your funding for not-for-profits, that's a significant issue. And so that's something that needs to be considered off the bat. Is virtual service delivery excluding people who need our services? This is something we ask ourselves all the time in the mental health and addiction sector. It's all fine to say we can deliver counseling over the internet, but when your clients don't all have internet service, may not even have phone service, that's an issue. And those are demographics that need to be served. So these are, again, questions and reality checks you can give your organization as you go through the answering these questions. Are staff wanting to return to a shared workspace? There's been so much talk lately about how colleagues and people are looking for more flexibility, how some don't want to come into the office at all. The last Stats Can report was 30% of Canadians are very happy with their dining room working. So if you have a staff that are eager to get back, that's definitely something to capitalize on and might promote a speedier return than in other situations. Next slide, please, John. So can we do so safely? And Jackie provided so many wonderful resources that we can use to answer this question for ourselves. But I thought I'd just go through my thought process again. So is opening permitted by law? And this is a question that may unfortunately change over time. The answer may change over time, and something that we'll need to keep our eyes on. One thing I've learned through COVID is there's no next step without back steps. So, as you embark on this, if you've not already done so and you're not fully open yet, just be mindful that this is not a point in time exercise. This is truly a work in progress, and that will include adjusting policies, adjusting protocols within your offices that will need to reflect the reality that we're going to live in for the next year or so with COVID. So are you allowed to open? That's a local public health decision. And can we comply with the requirements of local, provincial, federal public health authorities? So you may be aware that last week, the provincial government announced something called Directive 6, which mandates vaccines within certain sectors. And they are broadening that list of sectors over the next couple of months. So if you are an organization that is opening and you fall under Directive 6, you have to be able to comply with those requirements. You have to be able to safely store, health information when your colleagues show you their vaccine status evidence. You have to be able to store safely their notes from their doctor if they are exempt from vaccination and have to provide evidence. So it's just thinking through the logistics of certain requirements that might be placed on top of us by various levels of government before we open the door. Is our building able to provide a healthy and efficient workspace? And we talked about this quite a bit in the last half hour around ventilation. Another consideration for us was elevators. Only 2 people per elevator means a potentially very long wait to get up to the office in the morning. So just thinking about how that works, thinking about having confidence in what your building's protocols are, and establishing that relationship with your building so they know that you're an interested party and you know exactly what protocols they have in place and how you might be able to enhance them on your own or work with the building to make them more effective. Next question is, how is our workspace able to accommodate safe interactions? We have one floor where everyone has their own office. It's not a high density floor. And so there is lots of air circulation, the windows open and everything's fine. We have other spaces where we are packed into high density cubicle areas. And so the rules will need to be different in those sections, and then the thought process around how to keep people safe is a little bit different. So taking a very close look at your workspace, and it means literally walking through your workspace. If you're the executive director or the HR person for your organization, is an important part of making policy and protocols as you open up. Do we have the means and access to safety equipment required to minimize colleague exposure? So the government is providing now access to certain organizations of a certain size to rapid testing kits. So again, if you fall under that Directive 6 and are required to test if someone doesn't have validated vaccination evidence, then you're going to have to test them twice a week. And there will be other organizations who go beyond that minimum standard, who decide to test all people within their office, just understanding how COVID works and how it is possible to get infected if you are double vaccinated. So understanding whether your organization has access to free testing kits, has access to PPE, has access to those big, I'm forgetting the big plastic shields that everyone put up at the beginning of COVID. Well, many offices that haven't been open don't have those, for example, around their reception areas. So you need to be able to find the resources. There was a real shortage of that at the beginning of COVID. Now it's easier to find things, but then the question becomes, for not-for-profits, can we afford it? So asking these questions and thinking through all of these affordability issues is particularly important when we're on really tight budgets. And can we minimize external exposure? So this really challenges your thinking around, can you have a no guest policy? Do you limit the number of patients or visitors that come in at a given time? Do you have a central station downstairs where couriers can leave their packages like we have in our building, so they're not coming up to the floor, not breathing in the elevators, taking that space in the elevators? So thinking through all of those pieces, how do you minimize the exposures? And these are all things that the wonderful tools that Jackie shared with you will help you think through as well. Next slide, please. So what does a safe reopening look like? And this is where I'm going to put on my HR hat really firmly for a second. We are so service oriented as not-for-profits. It's important to remember that we are also employers. Most organizations have at least one employee, and many have more than that, although we are all highly reliant on volunteers as well. As an employer, it is your #1 responsibility to protect the health and safety of your employees. And that has to underline all of the decisions that you make when considering how safe your environment is. So please, please, please keep that in mind, that needs to be your driver as you come up with the protocols for what your office is going to look like. Then I also strongly recommend you develop clear and exhaustive office protocols, policies that address what we can control and acknowledge what we cannot. And a perfect example was already raised around transportation to and from the office. So including in your manual, including in your employee communications, the fact that you acknowledge that this is a challenge, providing links to the safety protocols and requirements for TTC vehicles, for GO vehicles, et cetera. And then reminding them that you are expecting them as a member of your organization to comply with the rules and regulations of those transportation authorities. So it's really important to include not just what we can control, but what we cannot as employers, because staff are dealing with a very, very large series of issues. This is an example of the agenda from our booklet right now. I think there's some really big things buried within that. Again, I'm just mindful of time. Working from the office, requirements and permissions. This is where you put things in place like your vaccination policy. This is where you make decisions around whether it's important to have all staff working from the office or if some positions can be done just as effectively from home. This is where you decide who comes in when and how often and for what purpose. And then you put any controls in place here, like having to complete the COVID assessment before you show up on site, and various things like that. So there's a lot buried within number one that is important to think through. Preparing yourself for the office is a sort of a psychological section that we have provided to our staff. It's actually links to a toolkit, which I'd be very happy to share with everyone. It's in final, it's being updated for this new reality. We created it last summer for people, again, when we thought that more people would be going back to work in the fall. And I'll come to some of this in a minute, so I'll keep going. We already talked about transportation to and from the office. Physically entering the office, this is about screening, testing, office protocols, building protocols that your staff will need to be made aware of. For those who haven't had staff on site for quite a long time, it's quite jarring to appear at a building that all of a sudden has big stop signs on the doors, that requires you to stop and sterilize when you come in, that makes people stand 2 meters apart. It's very different in a grocery store, which we've become accustomed to, but going back into a space that we were once familiar with that no longer looks the same way can be quite jarring. So anything you can do to kind of describe what that experience looks like before they get there can be very helpful. Infection control, I think we talked about that before. Internal, external meetings and visitors, just stretch your thinking, holding meetings outdoors, meeting external visitors on Zoom. For some, it may be important to continue meeting on Zoom, even if you're all in the office. Again, it really just comes down to what kind of safety controls you can put into place. We always plug the COVID alert app. It's still a tremendously helpful tool at letting people know when they've been exposed. It also takes the pressure off of contact tracing resources at the local level. So something I would recommend people build into their plan and communications with staff. And then sickness reporting and disclosure, very, very important to ensure that your policies are up to date around, we do not expect you to, we expect you to stay home, let me put it that way. If you have a runny nose and are not feeling well, it's one thing to put it into a screening document before they arrive on site, but also just very, very important to articulate what your expectations are from a policy perspective around sickness, around what kind of time off they can take that's paid, what they can do if they do end up getting sick and have run out of sick days, so on and so forth. So thinking through all of those pieces of your existing policy document is very important. And then how to raise a concern. And this just comes down to trust. You want to know that somebody is unhappy or worried or concerned before they leave with their feet, which is what is going to happen, I think, to a lot of organizations when they open the door. So make sure you provide in writing an opportunity for staff to raise their concerns once things kind of start to normalize, because it's an awful way to find out that there's a problem for them to tender their resignation. Next slide, please, John. So the final question was, can I address colleague stakeholder concerns effectively in a way that protects their psychological safety and engages and retains them? I just can't emphasize enough the importance of two-way communication with colleagues. It's fine to do it's important, it's necessary to do all your planning, all your documentation, and get all your ducks in a row. But if you have no trust with colleagues, or they don't understand, you don't understand what their real concerns are, or they don't understand some of the decision-making behind the various components, you won't have ultimately been successful at assuring them that that their safety is your primary concern. So to that note, you need to tell them. You need to start every communication with your health and safety are our primary concerns, and then make sure your protocols, policies demonstrate that. People are putting a lot of trust in us as employers as they enter the workspace again. Many people have vulnerable people in their homes. They have unvaccinated children in their homes. They have to travel on subways to get to you. They have to trust that when they get to their workspace, they are safe and they will stay healthy. And you need to say it to them that that is your priority, and then they can hold you accountable for that. So that's my recommendation in terms of starting to build that trust with staff. That this is your focus. I can't emphasize enough the importance of asking them what their concerns are. So last summer, we spent 2 months developing exhaustive protocols around returning to the office. And before we released it, we did a survey on staff concerns. And sort of halfway through, I guess. And it was amazing what people were concerned about that we hadn't really thought about, because we knew that there were protections in place, or we knew that there were ways to address it. And some were in our guide and some had not been put in our guide because we considered it a given. We'd been living and thinking this stuff for 6 months by that point. So what we were able to do then was make our final adjustments, issue the document again, and then 2 months later, we asked staff again, how are you doing? And we gave them the same questionnaire, minus a couple tweaks at the beginning and end. And it was a wonderful indicator of how well we had actually addressed their concerns and how effective our communications documents had been. So I do recommend you ask them, because there may be things that you haven't thought about, things that are just out of your control, but good for you to know that are on their minds. And I do recommend you do it anonymously, and let staff know that they can't, if they raise something, that you won't have any way of coming back to them, so that there's no expectation there that you're not able to meet. But do ask them what their concerns are. It will pay off in spades, and people care when they're asked what they're worried about, especially when they see those concerns addressed in future communications. To the point that's already been made, be open about the fact that timelines and opportunities will shift, could shift, and that we are actively monitoring the situation. The pandemic is not over, and that will just help people become a little bit more resilient. If they're expecting that things will flex and things will change, then they won't hang their hat on certain decisions that have been made or get as upset when they change. They'll have known it was coming and just have a little bit more forgiveness built in for that. And then consider the personal situations and realities when drafting your policies. And I'll come to this in a minute. But as I said before, there are people living with unprotected housemates, people with children who are unvaccinated, etc. John, just quickly, I think we're almost at the last page here. So provide direction to support resources, every opportunity that you get, and then provide them again. Put them on your website, send them in communications, put them on your intranet site, or put them in a shared folder within SharePoint. There are lots of things. You can direct them to your EAP if you have one. There are many free resources out there. Direct them to your insurance program benefits if you have various supports. Anything you can do to tell them that you are there, that these services are there for them and they should take advantage of them, will increase the likelihood that they do. There are exceptionally high levels of grief, addiction, and stress in our system right now. And that is coming into the workplace as you open it. So I'm not asking you to be therapists. I'm not a therapist, but it's important to understand where people are coming from and what they're dealing with. Giving them multiple opportunities and means to question and understand the plan, protocols, and policies. It's quite amazing. No matter how well you draft something, you can give the same document to 3 people and they'll read 3 very different things from it. So having information sessions where you go over the content, having small group meetings in case staff don't feel comfortable speaking up on large Q&A sessions, and then following up one-on-one with people's managers, or if you're small enough, you yourself as the CEO, goes a tremendously long way at helping people feel heard, helping them understand what you're saying and why. It can build a tremendous amount of trust. Give colleagues time to adjust being back and the power to control part of the process. I'm a firm advocate of having a transition period. So between everybody's home and everybody's back, giving people a period of several months where they can choose how often they can come in, they can choose when they come in. It just gets people used to the commute, used to being around other people, used to being in an office that they once knew without the pressure of, I must do this now. It's just a very, very effective tool for getting people back. It may also be helpful for you to differentiate in your communications between how flexible work arrangements might work now during the transition period while we're still dealing with COVID and afterwards. One of the things we found is that some people weren't actually scared to come back to the office. they just didn't want to come back to the office. They were very comfortable being at home. And so I think, that forces you as an organization to think through, as I'm sure many of you are, your reasons for having staff in person. And so it can sometimes be helpful to bifurcate the issue and deal with the now and then deal with the longer term later. Openly acknowledging not everyone's in the same place goes a long way, and looking for opportunities to safely demonstrate the value of being in person, to welcome new hires, to do brainstorming sessions. Those are all fun ways that people can see the value of taking that step and leaving the house to come into a shared workplace. It's a wonderful article from Harvard Business Review that I'll share with all of you. I read yesterday on how everyone's really having to come back for the first time. Now that really presents a great opportunity, but it also gives some tips for managers on how to address that and address people's concerns. Last page, John, is just a list of resources. This is certainly not exhaustive, but these are some that your organizations may wish to use yourselves or to direct staff to. So.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was fantastic content, and it's so helpful to hear the perspective of someone working in HR in the sector and that can speak to the experiences that we all have. We have tons of questions. We're going to compile them and get back to everyone with the package that you will get from this webinar, including the slides and resources as well. I'm just going to whip through a few real quick though while we have people on the phone. Hopefully this one is a quick one. Maybe Jackie, you can answer that. There was a bunch of people interested in the square footage per employee rule. Is it 150 square feet per employee? Is there a rule? Where is that? And where can they reference that?
I think generally we need to consider the 2-meter rule. So ensuring that you have like a 4-meter square space for each person, but you also need to consider the physical space of your environment as well. So this is free space that people can walk through. So you need to sort of subtract the space that's taken up by furniture and other types of things that already occupy the space where people can go through. And you also need to keep in mind that that 2-meter distance of trying to maintain physical distancing still applies as well. So even though if you do like a calculation of the square footage, you still need to consider how people are going to interact in that space and if it actually practically makes sense for that many people to be in that space at once. So it's also looking at the practicality of the space and the physical facility as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jackie. Kirsten, a bunch of questions about volunteers.
Yes.
So treating volunteers, when you're thinking about the return to work, return to the office, a lot of the things you talked about, how much of this would apply to volunteers or be completely different for volunteers?
Certainly. Well, legally, there's a different obligation that we have because we are not employers to volunteers. And so we're not covered by the Employment Standards Act or any of the governing, collective agreements that might be out there. So from a legal perspective, there's a different responsibility and liability associated with it. However, if you're an organization like ours, where you treat your volunteers as family and staff, it certainly makes sense to extend your policies to the volunteers in your space, and certainly as they relate to interacting with your staff members. But so yes, that's I would treat them the same way. However, it is important to note that with one, there is an employment relationship and all the legal obligations and responsibilities that come with that, and with the other, there is not.
Great. Thank you so much, Kirsten. A quick question about PPE, that non-medical masks are not, someone asked if they're not considered PPE, and what does this mean practically speaking? So Kirsten or Jackie, do you have an answer to that?
I can try to take that question. So when we talk traditionally about PPE, that is protection of the worker. So so that is the wearer is being protected by that equipment. So a non-medical mask is more of what we call source control. So you are protecting other people. So that's where that the definition gets to, so that PPE is protection of the wearer versus the non-medical mask is more protection for other people because it's being used as source control. So a non-medical mask would not be considered PPE. like a face covering or a non-medical mask, that is just another way, it's another layer of protection as source control. But when we're talking about PPE, that does need to be a surgical or procedural mask would be considered PPE, or in certain cases, if you require a respirator like an N95, then that would be considered PPE. That's just where the definition differs.
Okay, great. And I'm going to sneak one more question in before we wrap up about rapid test kits. There's a few questions about that. There's been some links shared about how to get them. But what are the requirements if you use rapid test kits or distribute them as an employer? Are your employees required to report back to you? And how and if they're not fully vaccinated, or does that depend, Kirsten, if you're one of those organizations that required to vaccinate?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that the Toronto Board of Trade is running a program in Toronto, and the provincial government's running a program as well. Both of them require that someone in the office who is an employee is trained as an administrator of the tests. So it's not something you send home with staff, it's something you do on site. And then the employer has an obligation to read the result, to record the result, and to report the result. So there's fairly specific direction on those two sites around the requirement there. I don't think it's an onerous training program, but certainly from a procedural standpoint and operational standpoint, you would need to build that into someone's responsibilities, and you'd need to find a way to coordinate that from a timing perspective during the day.
Okay, awesome. So we're going to end it there. Just a couple of things that I'll highlight. One, we will take all these questions and summarize them and try and get answers to you all for the ones that we didn't get to today. We will also, at ONN has an online resource center that I think my colleagues can put in the chat, where we're already collecting sample vaccination policies and toolkits for the sector by the sector, so you can see what other organizations are doing. CMHA has already graciously put many of their resources up on our resource center. And if any of you have found any or have any great ones that you can share with us, please encourage us. Our goal is to make sure that we're all not duplicating each other's work, and we're taking advantage of the expertise we have in our sector. So keep an eye out on the resource center. As we mentioned, we'll send you a follow-up package with the webinar and recordings and questions, as well as all of the links that our speakers suggested today. But I really do want to end. Jackie and Kirsten are such fantastic speakers and knowledgeable, and you've really brought so much information to those folks on the call today. We really appreciate your time to join us today, and we hope everyone has a safe recovery over the next few weeks. And please keep in touch with ONN about what other supports and tools can be helpful to you as we continue to recover and rebuild from this pandemic. So with that, thanks again, Kirsten and Jackie, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.